Many terrifying events in human history have changed the way we think about the world. Others have come dangerously close to changing the future to a much darker timeline. Number 10. When people speculate about the way the world might end, the possibility of a supervolcanic eruption wiping out humanity is a recurring theory. A supervolcanic eruption could have a devastating effect on the population, changing our way of life forever, if we were even able to survive. Such an event has happened at least once before in human history, and may have come close to wiping out the human race forever. On the Indonesian island of Sumatra lies Lake Toba, the largest lake in Indonesia, with a surface area of 440 square miles. It sits in the caldera of an ancient supervolcano, formed roughly 74,000 years ago. Scientists believe the Toba volcano has undergone a super eruption at least twice, once 840 years ago, long before modern humans existed, and then most recently 74,000 years ago, in what's called the youngest Toba eruption. The youngest Toba eruption reached the highest level on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, spewing hot ash, rock, and gas into the atmosphere. Most of these settled in the surrounding area, creating a thick layer of white powder across Indonesia and the Indian subcontinent. The material has been found on the sea floor across the Indian Ocean and reached at least as far away as the East African Rift Valley. The eruption was 11,000 times the size of that of Mount St. Helens in 1980, so large that it would be difficult for us to imagine today. Modern humans had already begun exploring the world outside of Africa by the time the Toba eruption took place. Archaeologists have found evidence of humans living in India at the time, who would have witnessed the blanket of ash so thick that it may have blocked out the sun. The extent of the consequences of the youngest Toba eruption is still being debated by scientists. Around the same time as the eruption, it's believed that humanity experienced a bottleneck. A decrease in the genetic diversity of Homo sapiens indicated that for some time, there may have been as few as 1,000 Homo sapiens alive on Earth. For a time, this was blamed on the Toba eruption. It was theorized that the eruption was so severe that all humans living outside of Africa were wiped out. Most of those inside Africa struggled to survive and had to rebuild and recover before venturing out into Asia and the rest of the world again. While we know how much ash and solid material erupted during the event, scientists haven't been able to determine how much sulfur was released into the atmosphere. This could drastically change just how significant the impact on the global climate was. It's possible that the eruption may have plunged the Earth into a volcanic winter, but scientists don't believe that it was the cause of an ice age that followed not long afterwards. In fact, the idea that the Toba eruption almost wiped out humanity is also now being disputed. Looking at archaeological sites in India, experts have found evidence of human settlement both before and after the eruption. The people here would have to change their way of life, but they did survive. Scientists now think that the impact of the Toba eruption varied depending on locations. It didn't stop the summer monsoon rains from hitting the Indian subcontinent, but there is evidence that it might have led to more arid conditions in Africa. This change in Africa may have actually led to innovation. Scientists found the earliest examples of what are believed to be arrowheads at a site in Ethiopia. It's believed that the change in conditions led to humans changing their hunting techniques. They also relied more heavily on fish for food, and this may have led the group to migrate northwards, as they depleted shallow pools of stock, eventually leading to another migration out of Africa. While the Toba eruption likely didn't almost cause the end of humanity, it would have been a terrifying experience for anyone who managed to survive. Number 9. During the Cold War, there were many incidents that could have changed the course of history forever. One of these started out as a routine reconnaissance mission over the Sea of Japan and could have ended in all-out war. In the late 1960s, the US military had been running reconnaissance missions along the Pacific coast of the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea. It was important to stay aware of the capabilities of these powers and what they might have been preparing for. The US Navy version of this was called the Beggar Shadow, which typically involved monitoring North Korea's air defense capabilities and communications. Flights would go out from Atsugi Naval Air Station in Japan, north to the border between North Korea and the Soviet Union. Then follow a path adjacent to the North Korean coast to monitor electronic communications from the Hermit State. At no point were any of the planes to reach North Korean airspace. In 1969, the USS Pueblo had been captured while it was 15 nautical miles off the North Korean coast. This should have been international waters, as a nation's territorial waters only reach up to 12 miles away from the coast, but that was of little concern to North Korea. The Pueblo incident was eventually resolved peacefully, but not before the sailors on board the vessel spent most of the year as prisoners. Because of this, beggar shadow flights were supposed to stay well clear of North Korean territory, and it was believed this would allow the crews to be safe. Despite this, and the fact that the North Korean Air Force had deployed 2 planes on the Homan airfield in March of 1969, the US believed that beggar shadow missions were still low risk, and didn't expect anything unusual to occur when a plane left Atsugi Base on April 15, 1969. The flight was an EC-121 plane, with the call sign Deep Sea 129. There were 31 people on board, almost twice the number that would typically be part of these missions. The cryptological professionals on board were training their replacements. They clearly weren't expecting anything other than a typical flight. The plane left Atsugi Base at 7 a.m. and entered the Sea of Japan at 12:30. The last communication with the plane came at 1300 hours when a nearby Kamiseya base received a routine check-in from the plane. 40 minutes later, strange activity was noticed at the North Korean Homan airfield. The EC-121 was notified that 2 planes had taken off and seemed to be on their way to intercept the American plane. The EC-121 didn't give any verbal response to the warning, but according to the NSA, the plane did turn back around and began to return to Japan. The North Korean planes continued after it though, and at 13:47, the EC-121 disappeared from radar. At first, it was hoped that the plane had simply dived too low to be picked up by radar. But when the next scheduled check-in came, there was no word from Deep Sea 129. Over the following days, debris was fished out of the Sea of Japan. Only 2 bodies were ever located, and the rest of the personnel aboard the EC-121 are considered lost at sea. In the US, there was pressure on then-President Richard Nixon to retaliate with force as a show of strength. But there was a risk that this would only escalate into a full-scale war, and Nixon instead decided to conduct training exercises in the Sea of Japan and resume reconnaissance flights with added protections. Number 8. In 1911, explorer Robert Falcon Scott and a team of 15 others left their base camp on a rocky cape known as Cape Evans. The goal was to become the first party to reach the South Pole. They were heading into the unknown, and the 5 men that made it to the pole would never return. Scott was an experienced Antarctic explorer who'd already made one push for the pole. As was the case with his first expedition, the main goal of the 1910 to 1913 expedition was scientific discovery. He brought with him 12 scientists to conduct zoology, botany, geology, glaciology, and meteorology work during the expedition. But as Scott left New Zealand aboard the whaler, the Terra Nova, his biggest personal aim was to become the first person to reach the most southern point in the world. The expedition landed in the McMurdo Sound and set up camp where they spent the first winter. Then it was time to make the 1,766-mile trek to the South Pole. Depots had been set up along the way, but the men still had to carry most of their supplies with them. Ponies and motorized sleighs had been brought along for the journey, but both proved to be unsuitable for the conditions. The ponies became exhausted, sinking so far into the snow that their legs were completely covered. And in the end, the men had to abandon the aids and pull the sleighs themselves. On November 24, 1911, 2 men were sent back to base camp. Another 2 men were turned around on December 11th. On January 4th, 1912, the party split a final time. Scott would only be taking 4 others with him for the final push to the South Pole. These were Dr. Edward Wilson, Captain Lawrence Oates, Henry Bowers, and Edgar Evans. The 4 remaining men who traveled with them this far turned around, not knowing that this was the last time they would ever see any of them. The final 5 made the last push to the South Pole. All were exhausted and suffering from frostbite, but on January 17th, they reached their destination. To their dismay, they didn't find the untouched piece of wilderness they'd been looking for. They instead discovered a campsite and a Norwegian flag. The men had been beaten to the South Pole by a party led by Roald Amundsen. Despite what would have been an obvious disappointment, the men raised the British flag at the South Pole and took photographs to celebrate their achievements. They then began the long march back to base camp. The weather on the return journey was especially harsh. Scott continued to keep a diary writing about snowstorms that made it difficult for them to find their way. A month after they reached the pole, Edgar Evans passed away in his sleep. Captain Oates was the next to succumb to the terrible conditions. He'd been suffering for a while and had once asked his companions to leave him behind. They refused, so Oates decided to walk out into the blizzard alone. Scott recorded his last words as, "I'm just going outside and maybe some time." The final 3 members of the party continued to struggle on. On March 19, 1912, they set up a camp for the final time. Another blizzard took them over, and they found they didn't have the energy to leave the campsite again. On March 29th, Scott made his final diary entry. It will be 8 months before the campsite was discovered. Number 7. In the early hours of the morning of June 3, 1980, a national security advisor was woken by a phone call that would lead to the most terrifying few minutes of his life. The NORAD system had detected hundreds of nuclear weapons that had been launched from the Soviet Union toward the US. If the alert was correct, it would be less than half an hour before he and everyone he knew lost their lives. Thankfully, it was a false alarm, and no retaliatory action took place. There had been a few false alarms during the Cold War on both sides, the most famous incident occurring in 1983, when sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds triggered the Soviet alarm system. But while the Soviet mistakes are more famous, the US had more than its fair share of close calls, including one instance in 1979 when a training tape was placed into the wrong machine, which led to the system believing the USSR had launched a complete nuclear attack. It was only a few months after the incident when another, even more terrifying hoax occurred. Not long after midnight on June 3rd, the US warning centers all received news that an attack was incoming. A computer that typically read that 0 weapons had been launched was now reading that 220 destructive weapons were on their way to the US. This time, there'd been no training tape mix-up or any obvious explanation for why this had occurred, other than the possibility that the computer was correct and nuclear war had begun. William Odom, the military assistant to the National Security Advisor, had the job of informing the advisor of the alert. He would then inform President Carter, who would have just a few minutes before deciding on his course of action. The advisor told Odom to get more information on the attack and the potential targets. Shortly afterwards, he received another call. Odom informed him that there'd been a mistake. It wasn't 220 weapons that had been launched, but 2,220. 200 of these had come from submarines, while the rest were intercontinental and would take a little longer to arrive. By this point, the Strategic Air Command had scrambled into action, with pilots sent to jets, and missile launch sites notified to be on standby. The advisor was preparing to call the president when he received a third phone call. Odom again said there'd been a mistake, but thankfully, this time he said there were no weapons at all coming. The computer still read that over 2,000 weapons were heading in their direction, but none of the other detection systems had alerted them to anything. Most telling was the fact that there'd been no seismic waves detected from the launch site, which had occurred during every other launch. It would later emerge that there'd been a fault with one computer chip that had almost caused the end of the world. For some reason, rather than showing zeros, it had started showing 2s. This chip cost less than 50 cents. This wouldn't be the last time that a small computer chip caused such a problem, and another alert came 3 days later. But this one didn't cause the same level of alarm, and the false alarm was ignored. The advisor described how he hadn't spoken to his wife, as he knew there was nothing she could do. While she and the rest of the US slept, he was dealing with the possibility that the end of the world had come. Luckily, the crisis was averted, this time. Number 6. The beginning of the 20th century was a difficult time for San Francisco. In 1906, an earthquake and fire reduced the city to the ground. but there had already been an ongoing disaster that claimed the lives of over 100 people since 1900. It's impossible to say for certain when exactly the bubonic plague entered the continental states. In the late 1800s, the disease had torn through India and China, claiming the lives of millions of people. From there, it spread around the world, transmitted by fleas on rats that would stow away on sailing ships. In the summer of 1899, one such ship from Hong Kong arrived in San Francisco. During the journey, there were 2 reported cases of plague on board, and the ship was quarantined on Angel Island. 11 stowaways were found. 2 managed to slip out of the ship. Their bodies were later located, and plague bacteria was found in their systems. This didn't immediately trigger an epidemic, though. It's likely that there was no one single ship that brought the plague to the US, but rats from many vessels slipped into the Californian city. In March of 1900, a man named Wong Chut King passed away due to the disease. He was the first diagnosed case of bubonic plague in the US. King was a lumber seller living in San Francisco's Chinatown. Authorities assumed that the plague would be focused there, and the entirety of Chinatown was quarantined without warning. This was quickly lifted as it stopped businesses and drew attention to the disease. Authorities were reluctant for word about the disease to spread. They were worried about the economic impact if other states decided they no longer wanted to trade with San Francisco or California as a whole. Even the US Surgeon General helped to deny the existence of the plague, even as the chief quarantine officer of the Marine Hospital Service, Joseph Kenyon, tried to control the epidemic. Kenyon was accused of faking the epidemic by injecting people who'd already passed away with the bubonic plague. This was as dozens of people, mostly in San Francisco's Chinatown, came down with the infection. Unfortunately, attitudes towards people who lived in the area meant that there was little trust between residents and the authorities, which only led to the plague spreading further. Eventually, Kenyon was replaced by Dr. Rupert Blue. He had a more successful time at helping to combat the disease. He had a better relationship with the Chinatown residents who were at the epicenter of the new epidemic. He was also helped by the fact that news had spread to the rest of the states, who were now refusing to do business with California unless the plague was eradicated. A new governor was elected, and a public health campaign was finally put in place. People knew that it was the rats that were spreading the plague, and an effort to clean up San Francisco took place. By 1904, the initial outbreak was over. Over 100 people passed away, but it's suspected that the real number of cases may be higher than what the officials were able to record. 2 years later, the earthquake and fire reduced most of San Francisco to rubble and left both the human and rat populations homeless. Another outbreak of the plague followed as people lived in temporary camps while the city was rebuilt. Thankfully, this time the outbreak was taken seriously. 160 new cases were identified, but less than half of these resulted in victims passing away. Number 5. On the night of November 25th, 1120, a ship sank not far from the coast of France, claiming the lives of around 300 people. The consequences of the disaster changed English history forever. Henry I, the son of William the Conqueror, was the King of England at the time. He was also the Duke of Normandy and still had possessions in France. Because of this, he had to go pay homage to the King of France. He sent his son and heir, William Adelin, in his place, and waited in Normandy for his return. William was described as having an extremely pampered childhood, but on the occasions where he reigned in his father's absence, he proved himself to be fairly competent. It looked as if the English crown would be in good hands when William took the throne. The ceremony with the King of France went well, and William joined his father in Normandy so they could return to England. Henry took his own ship back to England, but William was approached by a man named Thomas Fitzstephen, who asked if he would be allowed to sail the prince home. Fitzstephen was the son of Stephen Fitz-Ared, who had captained the ship that took William the Conqueror to England in 1066. He was also a captain in his own right, and had a newly refurbished ship, the White Ship, which was known for its speed and beauty. William accepted, and many of the young nobles that had traveled with the royal family to France decided to stay with him. Among those were his half-sister Matilda, his cousin Stephen of Blois, and the steward of the royal household. As they waited to leave, the nobles began drinking, and it wasn't long before everyone had drunk too much. Stephen of Blois decided to disembark the white ship before it set sail, as did 2 monks who believed the ship had become overcrowded with righteous youths. At some point, the sailors aboard the ship were encouraged to drink, and nobody was in a fit condition to be sailing when they left port to make for the English coast. Fitzstephen was challenged to reach England before Henry's ship, which had left many hours earlier. He accepted the challenge. That led to the ship hitting an outcrop of rocks. The ship sank quickly. There was one small boat on board which William was placed into to ensure survival. He would have been able to survive the incident, but according to historical accounts, he ordered the oarsman to turn back when he heard his half-sister. He tried to help her, but others who were in the water also tried to climb aboard the boat and it capsized. Only one person managed to survive the incident, a butcher from Rouen who spent the night clinging to a piece of debris. The incident was obviously devastating to King Henry. Not only did he lose his heir, but he also lost 2 other children who were on the white ship. Henry had many illegitimate children, but his only legitimate children were William and his older sister, another Matilda. Matilda was named as Henry's heir, but when Henry passed away in 1135, Matilda's rule came into dispute. England had never been ruled by a queen, and many nobles supported her cousin, Stephen of Blois, who'd only escaped the white ship disaster at the last minute. A period of civil war known as the Anarchy followed. It was a particularly brutal and destructive period, and many more people lost their lives before a peace was negotiated. Number 4. For the medieval knights and commoners involved in the events, the acts of the Crusades would be some of the most scary moments in history. For more than 2 centuries, armies marched across Europe and Levant, leaving destruction behind them as they tried to reclaim various locations in the name of the Catholic Church. While all the Crusades had more than their share of destruction and terror, one of the strangest and most destructive of the Crusades was the event known as the Fourth Crusade. Up until this point, the numbered Crusades had mostly been conducted by nobles or kings from various European households. It was during the Third Crusade that Richard the Lionheart of England reached his fame. In terms of land seized and lost, it had been a mixed affair for the Europeans. The First Crusade had resulted in the Holy Land being seized by the Crusaders and partitioned into Crusader states, but the Egyptian rulers had since taken over. The Third Crusade had secured safe passage for pilgrims, but Jerusalem was still in Egyptian hands. The Fourth Crusade was called by Pope Innocent III in 1198. The goal was to retake the Levant in the name of Christendom. But this time, the crusade wouldn't receive the support of kings or nobles. Richard the Lionheart refused the call, as he was fighting his own battles against the King of France. Instead, this crusade would be fought by ordinary knights. These might have been skilled soldiers, but they didn't have the finances needed to go on the campaign. Even the likes of the King of England had to sell off titles and levy heavy taxes to go on crusade. The financial problems became apparent when the crusading forces arrived in Venice. They had no way of getting across the Mediterranean and had to come up with a deal with the Venetian rulers. Venice would provide an enormous number of ships, as well as food for 9 months. In return, they would get 85,000 marks, which was twice the annual reserve of France. The Crusaders agreed, but soon discovered they couldn't pay the fee. Venice had almost bankrupted itself to provide these ships, so they were eager to get payment in some way. They suggested the Crusaders attack the city of Zara, which was a fellow Christian city, but one that was at odds with Venice. The Crusaders obliged, and the area was attacked and defeated. But that only made the Pope angry, and the Crusaders were excommunicated. The excommunication would later be rescinded, but the Pope ordered the Crusaders to not attack any more Christian cities without good reason. They still needed money, though, and needed support to make it to Egypt. Alexios, the crown prince of Constantinople, seemed to give them a good reason. His father had recently been deposed by his uncle, Alexios III, and he was looking for support in retaking the city and deposing his uncle. He promised an enormous payment if they helped him. The Crusaders obliged, and together with Venetian soldiers, they attacked Constantinople. The walls of the city had protected it for centuries, but the crusading forces were able to find their way in, setting fires in their wake. Emperor Isaac was brought out of the dungeons and reinstated as emperor, with the Prince Alexios as his co-emperor. But they couldn't pay the money promised to the Crusaders. They melted down artifacts, but it still wasn't enough to meet the promised fee. Isaac and Alexios were eventually deposed by an angry populace, and a new emperor was proclaimed. The Crusaders decided to attack the city to take what they were owed. Constantinople fell again, this time becoming a Crusader state as Baldwin of Flanders was proclaimed emperor. Much of the city had been burned to the ground, with countless lives ruined. The Fourth Crusade would never make it to Egypt. Number 3. Apollo 12 isn't nearly as well known as its predecessor or successor. The mission was the second successful mission to the moon, and from the outside, nothing seriously amiss seemed to take place. The biggest issue seemed to be that the astronauts pointed their camera at the sun for too long, destroying the lens. But that only came after a terrifying event that could have made the mission one of NASA's most memorable. The launch date was set for November 14, 1969, only a few months after the successful Apollo 11. A cold front had passed over the Kennedy Space Center, and there were lightning storms the day before, but the weather had cleared up slightly by the time the mission was to launch. President Richard Nixon was one of the people who'd gathered at the Space Center to watch the launch, and Mission Control was keen not to miss this launch window. If they didn't get off the ground that day, it would be another month before conditions were right for another attempt. The 3 astronauts who would be taking part in the mission were Commander Pete Conrad, Command Module Pilot Richard Gordon, and Lunar Module Pilot Alan Bean. There was a low level of electricity in the air as the countdown for the launch began, but it wasn't enough to cause a lightning storm. At exactly 11:23 local time, the Saturn V rocket was launched. 36.5 seconds after launch, a lightning strike hit the rocket and reached the ground. 52 seconds into the flight, another strike hit the rocket. Despite the 2 lightning bolts, everything seemed fine from the outside. The rocket continued on its planned flight, reaching incredible speeds and accelerative force as it made for orbit. But inside the module, it was very clear that something was wrong. All of the emergency lights had lit up, something that had never happened before. Even during training exercises, it was normally only a few system failures that were tested at once. There didn't seem to be any explanation for why so many different things had gone wrong, and Mission Control in Houston was just as confused. There was thankfully still a radio connection between the astronauts and Mission Control, so those back at base would be able to tell the astronauts how to fix the problem. The problem was that they had no idea what had happened. The data that had been transmitted didn't make any sense and was sending seemingly random patterns. It was environmental control engineer John Aaron who figured it out. He'd seen the exact same pattern during a test when the signal conditioning equipment suffered a drop in power. It was only a small switch and one that most people wouldn't have paid any attention to. Aaron knew how to fix the problem and told the crew to switch the SCE to the auxiliary power. Commander Conrad had no idea what the SCE was, but Bean knew the switch and was able to complete the task. The switch seemed to fix the problem, and the crew spent their time in orbit, putting the rest of the systems back in place. After a few uneventful days in space, they landed on the moon and began their work collecting scientific samples and leaving behind a set of equipment for experiments that would be conducted after they left. There was still one last moment of panic during the mission, though. At Mission Control, they had no way of knowing if the lightning strikes had had any impact on the parachutes, and these needed to be used during re-entry. Nobody had told the astronauts about this, as there was nothing they could do to fix the problem. But as the 3 men returned to Earth, staff back at base watched and waited to see if they really had avoided disaster. Thankfully, the parachutes launched at the perfect time, and all 3 astronauts made it back to Earth safely. Number 2. In March of 1911, a terrifying fire ripped through a New York factory in what remains one of the most devastating industrial accidents in the city's history. The factory was located on the top 3 floors of a 10-story building in Manhattan, New York. It was owned by Max Blanc and Isaac Harris, who also owned a number of other garment factories in the city. They were known for being anti-union and made efforts to make sure their workers were under control. One of the 2 stairwells that led down from the factory was locked to prevent theft, and possibly to stop union organizers from entering the building. They'd also neglected to install sprinkler systems. About 500 people worked in the factory, sitting at lines of sewing machines and manufacturing women's blouses. Beneath the tables were industrial bins for scrap fabric, which could go unemptied for months at a time. The workers would work for up to 12 hours a day for very little pay. They were mostly young women who'd recently immigrated to the US from countries like Italy. It was shortly before the end of the day on March 25, 1911, when the fire broke out. It's believed that a match or cigarette butt was accidentally thrown into one of the bins on the 8th floor, where it lit the scrap of fabric on fire. It wouldn't take long for the blaze to grow out of control. A bookkeeper was able to make workers on the 10th floor aware of the fire, but there was no way of contacting the 9th floor. It wasn't until the flames reached them that the workers realized something was wrong. The main route out of the factory was the elevators, but only a handful of people could pile into the small space at once. The elevator workers took multiple trips to try to get as many people to safety as possible, but eventually the heat from the fire warped the rails and they couldn't go any further. Many of the remaining workers went to the stairwells to try to escape. They found the door at the bottom of one was locked, leaving them trapped at the bottom of the staircase. There was a fire escape located outside the building, but this was not well maintained and may have even been broken before people started piling onto it, and it wasn't long before it collapsed. The fire brigade had been alerted just minutes after the blaze began. A huge crowd formed outside the building and watched as the engines extended ladders to try to reach victims still trapped inside. Unfortunately, these ladders only reached up to the 7th floor, below where the victims were trying to escape. Those on the 10th floor, including Blanc and Harris, managed to escape to the roof, then cross over to adjacent buildings, but those beneath were not so lucky. It didn't take long for the fire department to get the blaze under control, but by that point the damage had been done. 146 people lost their lives and another 78 received wounds. The terrifying incident led to reforms in worker safety and inspired figures that would go on to have important influence in politics in the following decades. Blanc and Harris were tried for their role in the negligence but found not guilty. They were ordered to pay $75 to the families of each victim and received $60,000 from the insurance company for their own losses. Number 1. In April of 1989, a horrifying incident more than 1,000 feet beneath the surface of the ocean took place. Trapped in an airtight confined space, a fire began to burn on the Soviet submarine, Kmollets, leaving the 69 people on board with a terrifying decision to make. The Kmollets, or K-278, was one of the most advanced Soviet submarines to date. While the US submarines prioritized stealth, the Soviets aimed to go deeper and faster than their American counterparts. The Kmollets was designed to reach depths of over 1,000 meters, or 3,350 feet. A double hull, one of which was made from titanium, allowed it to reach this incredible depth. It was originally designed to simply be a test bed for future submarine designs, but it had operational capabilities and was equipped with both nuclear and conventional weapons. For years, she performed trials and tests, but in 1989, the decision was made to dispatch her on her first operational platform. Due to a number of automated systems on board, the submarine could run with a relatively limited crew. Led by Captain First Rank Yevgeny Vanin, there were 69 crew members on board for the mission into the Norwegian Sea. Most were newly trained in how to operate the ship, and there wasn't a damage control party. On April 7th, a fire broke out in the aftward part of the ship. A rupture in some high-pressure air lines led to damage in the oil system. Oil hit the hot turbine and was set alight. Captain Vanin acted fast. The submarine was equipped with watertight doors to seal off parts of the ship, including the engine room. Unfortunately, the fire was still able to spread through the cable penetration areas. The crew tried to extinguish the fire, but the submarine's nuclear reactor had shut down, and the decision was made to surface. For hours, the Kmollets remained on the surface, and aircraft from the Soviet Union were dispatched to send rafts for the survivors. But at 4:30 p.m. local time, the submarine began to sink, and Vanin gave the order to abandon ship. Men tried to climb aboard the rafts, but the sea conditions made it difficult to maneuver. The water was near freezing, and many survivors began to suffer from hypothermia. Meanwhile, Vanin and 5 others had stayed on board the sub to stop the fire and reach people who hadn't heard the abandoned ship order. They had to give up, and one of the party was lost in the fire. The remaining 5 men reached the escape pod, but it malfunctioned as it reached the surface. Only one of the 5 were able to survive. Over an hour after the Kmollets sank, a floating fish factory finally arrived at the scene and began to lift sailors out of the freezing water. Many had already passed away due to hypothermia, and many more would succumb to the condition after being lifted out of the water. A total of 42 people lost their lives in the disaster. Most of them had survived the fire but found themselves trapped on rafts in the ice-cold Norwegian Sea, with help nowhere in sight. There was significant backlash back home in Russia, and a charity was set up to support the widows and children of men who lost their lives in the incident. No other boats in the K278 class were built. Today, the Kmollets still lies at the bottom of the ocean, slowly leaking nuclear material into the water. Scientists have determined that the material is significantly diluted before it reaches the fishing areas, and it shouldn't pose a danger to sea life. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.